Welcome back, Netrunner fans, to part 6 of my core set retrospective, in which we're looking at the core set from the perspective of 2015 and the things that we know about the game today. In this section, we're going to be looking at the NBN cards that were in the core set. If you haven't had a chance to watch the other parts, I'd recommend doing so, especially the Anarch one. There were some ideas that I talked about in those videos that I'm not going to fully repeat in this video, but might be important to some of the things I'm talking about. The first card we're looking at is the ID for NBN, which was Making News. This is easily my least favorite of all of the IDs in the core set on both sides of the game. But that isn't necessarily because it's a terrible design or has bad ideas. In general, the idea of focusing NBN on this trace stuff I think was a pretty smart way to start out the faction, but this was massively overshadowed and discarded for the subsequently printed IDs, especially Near Earth Hub. This is because there's only two real ways to play NBN, dedicated fast advance, or something based around tagging them with mid-season. You don't really need these two recurring credits attached to your ID just to pump mid-season. The narrow range of strategies for NBN is going to be the focus of this video, and a lot of that has to do with Astro Script pilot program, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Even irrespective of the Astro Script problem, I think it's fair to say that this is the weakest of the core set IDs, just in terms of its economic boost. It might be easy to look at something like Engineering the Future and think, well, Engineering the Future only gives us 1 credit every turn, whereas Making News potentially gives us 2 credits every turn. The two big mistakes of this type of thinking are, first of all, Engineering the Future triggers on both players' turns. So like with Kate, it's generally pretty easy to get a credit on your turn and then a credit on your opponent's turn as well. This is especially true with the printing of things like Architect. Makes it a lot easier to get that credit by installing something on your opponent's turn. So in general, there are some ways to get the 2 credits, and we don't have to have finicky stuff like initiating traces. The other big point is that these 2 credits only matter if boosting the trace does something. A lot of times, if we were going to trace the runner and they weren't going to fight the trace and it was just going to automatically succeed, it doesn't really matter if we pump 2 more credits into that trace, since it was going to succeed anyway. The easiest way to realize an economic advantage from these recurring trace attempt credits is with ICE that initiate trace attempts. We got some pretty good ones of those in the core set, and in the Genesis cycle we got a whole lot of new good ones as well. But as the card pool has expanded, there's been less and less incentive to try to do that type of thing, because we've gotten a lot of better ICE that fit a variety of roles, so there's not a whole lot of reason to tailor your deck around these trace ICE. I would have liked to see this have an easier way to realize an economic advantage. My idea is that the 2 recurring credits could still be used for the trace attempt, but they could also be used to res tracer subtype ICE. Not only would this make the economic boost from this card way stronger, it would also give you a deck building incentive to including lots of tracer subtype ICE in your deck, which, like I said, there's some pretty strong ones just in the core set and the Genesis cycle, and in the modern day we've seen a lot of really good ones printed as well. That said, they tend to all be centuries, or most of them are centuries, so there would certainly be some limitations there. You're not going to want to play a exclusively centuries deck. Next up, we have the card that has easily caused the most controversy of any card printed, and that's Astro Script Pilot Program. This is easily my least favorite card in the entire Netrunner card pool, and it's frankly astonishing that this card hasn't been banned, restricted, reprinted with a nerf, something. I'd like to start out by saying that I'm not fundamentally opposed to the idea of an agenda that makes it easier to score subsequent agendas, but I'd like to compare and contrast Nisei Mark II with Astro Script. Both of these agendas are similar in that they make it easier to score agendas once you get one of them scored, but the big difference between these two cards is that Nisei Mark II's ability is rooted in the fundamental point of interaction between the two players, the run, whereas Astro Script is one-sided. All it does is make it mechanically simpler to score, and the runner really doesn't have any way to engage with that outside of card effects. The other point of preface that I want to make is that I'm not fundamentally opposed to the idea of fast advance. But in my view, fast advance needs to be the primary strategy of your deck. You need to make some concessions when it comes to deck building in order to make fast advance work. And one of the big problems with Astro Script is that you don't even really have to dedicate that much of your deck to fast advancing to have the best scoring pattern in the game. In practice, this means that all you need to include is 3 Astro Scripts and 3 Beals to have the ability to very easily score out on the opponent. This has the distorting effect of making the agenda packages of NBN decks very samey, because all you really have to do is shoehorn in these 6 cards to make your deck have a very powerful scoring package. This also has the effect of pushing lots of other agendas out of playability, because if they don't interact well with this 3-for-2 pattern, there's really no point to play them. It's hard to imagine a future for NBN where they would be able to include 4-for-2s or 5-for-3s for any reason other than some win-accessed or difficult-to-steal effect. Something that frustrates a lot of players with these decks packed full of 3-for-2s is that there's a lot of random I-win situations on both sides of the game. It's easy as the corporation to just randomly draw an Astro Script, especially after shuffling with a Jackson Howard, and then say, oh look, I can score this, I guess I will. This can also easily happen on the runner side of the game, where a Maker's Eye or a medium deep dig hits 2 of these 2-pointers, and then you're halfway to winning just on that single run. The biggest problem with Astro, in my view, is that the ability is tied to a 3-for-2 body. If we compare this to most of the 4-for-2s in the game, I think it's fair to say that this ability is much stronger than almost all of the 4-for-2s and 5-for-3s in Netrunner. And the fact that as a 3-for-2, Astro allows you to score other Astros very, very easily. This play is commonly known as the Astro Train. This is really the biggest reason why the card is so uninteractive. Much to the game's detriment, the designers have tried to tackle this Astro chaining problem with card effects like Clot, and this has 2 very negative effects on both sides of the game. First of all, as collateral damage, a bunch of Corp decks are really reduced in playability because of the fact that Clot exists. So easy examples are HB Fast Advance or Cerebral Imaging Combo. Both of these decks are pretty interesting and are both pretty fair, and they're not as easy to play because of the addition of Clot and the viability of Clot. The bigger problem is on the runner side of the game, where the playability of Clot is not even among the factions. It's extremely difficult to play Clot in a criminal deck, and Clot incentivizes the play of effects that were already really, really good within the Shaper faction, like SMC and Clone Chip. The biggest point that I'm trying to make is that Astro Script very significantly narrows the range of viable competitive decks, both because of its effect on the NBN card pool, but also on the distorting effects of the responses to it, like Clot. I would argue that the printing of effects like Clot have done a lot of damage to the card pool, but in this video I'm most interested in looking at ways that we could deal with the Astro Script problem with some sort of reprint or nerf. First of all, it's obvious to me that Project Beal should have been the 3-for-2 in the core set instead of Astro Script. And if we were going to make a change for Core Set 2.0, that would be the biggest thing I would advocate. Beal is a much more interesting card than Astro Script. It has good interaction with a bunch of add counter effects like Psychographics, and in general it just incentivizes deck building around it a lot more than something like Astro Script does. The biggest disappointment I have with Netrunner, and there are honestly very, very few disappointments I have with this game, but my biggest one is that the designers didn't take one of the hundreds, maybe thousands of suggestions from the community on how to fix Astro Script. I've picked my 3 favorites here, and I don't really have a way to credit anyone for these suggestions because frankly I think a lot of independent thinkers have all come up with the same solutions together. The first and maybe most obvious solution would be to change the agenda body that the Astro Script ability is attached to. So making it a 4 for 2, for example, would encourage you to either stack fast advance effects to get it scored, or just install and advance it like you normally would with a 4 for 2. The other potential solution along these lines would be to make it a 3 for 1, so that when you chain together Astro Scripts or use fast advance effects, the primary thing you're getting is the ability rather than a bunch of points. I think it's fair to say that one of the big problems now is that you both get a bunch of points and the powerful ability. The other suggested solution that I like is just restricting Astro Script. In other words, making it limit 1 per deck. This would certainly remove the problem of the Astro Train, but it would still preserve some of the powerful fast advance utility of the card. The easiest of these 3 solutions to implement would be the latter one. We could easily just ban or restrict Astro Script, and we wouldn't have to print a second edition of the core set or somehow reprint Astro Script in a data pack. That said, I think the designers are very much anti-banned restricted list, and I think for some good reason. Banned restricted lists are really unfun for new players. It's really frustrating as a new player if you start playing a game and you include some powerful thing in a deck that you've created yourself, only to learn that that card is banned or restricted. You definitely feel very cheated in that situation. For this reason, I think the better and more complete solution to the problem is to just reprint Astro Script with some type of nerf. I don't necessarily have a preference as to which of these reprints is done. I would just rather see something like a reprint than the additional printing of stuff like Clot. The next card that we're going to talk about is Breaking News. I really like this design, and I think that the card is starting to serve a new role in the game that is more what it was intended to do. It's been pretty lame that the main use for this card has been scoring the 7th point out of hand after you've chained a bunch of Astros together. The modern flatline-oriented NBN decks are using this a lot more to not only enable things like Scorched Earth and Traffic Accident, but also using it to undermine the runner's resources by trashing their critical card like Aesop's Pawn Shop. I like this design quite a bit, and I think that this card interacting well with Scorched and the damage-oriented stuff is definitely working as intended. I'd like to see a few more tag punish effects within NBN that are actually good enough, and it seems a little lame that really the only thing we do with tags is flatline the runner. This has a lot to do with the influence cost of meat damage effects, but that's a story for another day. The next card that we have is Anonymous Tip. This card is certainly no Diesel. The obvious reason why this card has seen such little play is the addition of Jackson Howard to the card pool and just the ubiquity of Jackson Howard. There's really no reason to play something like this when you could just click Howard and draw even more cards, plus you get that nice utility shuffle effect from Howard as well. This would be a perfect candidate for a card that had some sort of subtype that mattered. Really, we don't have that many subtypes that matter on either side of the game, and on the corporation side, I think the subtypes on operations are largely irrelevant. I would have liked to see this have the transaction subtype so that it worked with the core set Wayland. I think it's fair to say that there aren't that many good effects that have the transaction subtype, and this one maybe would fit into those Wayland decks because generally their economy is so operation focused that you could draw into something with anonymous tip and then play a bunch of burst economy. This was a direct reprint from the original game, but it was made much weaker because Jackson Howard is just way stronger than any sort of draw and recursion effect from the original game. Next up is closed accounts. Here's another direct reprint from the original game, and I think that it makes a lot of sense as a tag punishment effect. It's hard to land tags on the runner, and NBN is supposed to be the faction that's really good at that, which they largely have been. They just don't really have anything to do once you get them tagged. Closed account is a pretty good exception to that, and I think this card is largely worked out really well, especially in the era that was dominated by account siphon. This was one of the few ways that you could punch the runner back after you got siphoned. Next up we have Psychographics. I'm a huge fan of this design, and I really wish that this would have been more popular over the history of the game. We've seen a lot of people try to do the mid-season replacements plus this thing sort of deck, but I think we've proven that the two main builds of NBN, both the dedicated fast advance and the flatline oriented with Scorched Earth, are just both more effective than trying to play with something like this. If you can land a mid-season, it's much better to just outright win the game than it is to mess around with psychographics. I see this as being kind of a twofold problem. On one hand, it's too easy to play Scorched Earth and the flatline-oriented meat damage effects. I'm going to talk about this a little more in the Wayland video, but in general, I think that the influence cost of meat damage effects is too low, and that those effects need to be more exclusive to Wayland. The other component of this is that the tag effects within NBN are too hit or miss. They're too very binary. It's really only SEA Source or Mid-Season that are good enough to play, and a lot of the tracer-oriented ice is pretty underpowered, or there's just a comparable piece of ice that isn't a trace tag ice. So I think that we're starting to see a shift in that design philosophy. Things like Gutenberg have shown us that we can have good tracer tag effect ice that are also pretty cheap and very effective at defending servers. I think that the designers are starting to get the right idea with these tracer ice, but I think Psychographics has largely been unplayable because the only way that you can really tag the runner is mid-season, and if you're going to do that, you might as well just flatline them. Next up, we have SEA Source. This is another sort of reprint from the original game, but since the trace system was fundamentally reworked, this card has behaved very differently in new Netrunner. The only way that this card has ever seen play is in combination with Scorched Earth. Specifically 2 Scorched Earths plus this has been one of the easiest ways to flatline the runner from the beginning. Now we've definitely moved away from SEA Source for quite a few different reasons. Both mid-season replacements and nowadays breaking news have proven to be much more effective ways to tag the runner. Breaking news is really effective because you don't even have to have a credit advantage, and mid-season replacements is really effective because you can hit them with it when you do have a credit advantage, and then later flatline them because they have so many tags. I'm not sure why this needed to be in NBN. It seems to me like it would have been a lot better in Wayland. NBN flatline decks have almost always been better than Wayland ones, mainly because you get much better agendas within NBN. You not only have the Astro Script Beal thing, but you also have breaking news, which is probably the easiest way to tag the runner overall. There were definitely some good ideas here. The fact that the runner can just avoid it by not making runs and things like that definitely seems fair to me. But overall, I think this card is just kind of bad when we compare it to the modern day tag tools. I wanted to quickly show 2 tag effects from original Netrunner to show how much easier it was to land tags for the purposes of flatline in original Netrunner. These two effects don't rely on having more credits than the runner, and that's the big difference between SEA Source and these effects. The designers definitely had the right idea by reducing the power level of the flatline stuff in the new game, but I think they should have focused more on reducing the power level of the meat damage effects like Scorched Earth rather than very much nerfing these tag effects. I think the resultant consequence of this has been that really the only thing you can do with tags is this very binary you win or you don't kind of thing, and that has made the tag part of the game far less interesting than it could have been. Next up we have Ghost Branch. Like with most of these advanceable traps, this one just really hasn't seen that much play. And in general, I think advanceable traps are pretty bad. I've talked a lot on my channel about how I think that these advanceable traps need to have huge payouts to be worthwhile, and I don't really think giving them the tags is good enough. Now, I don't necessarily think it's a huge problem that there was a weaker effect like this. I just think this needed to be a little better to even be worth including, period. My idea is that it could have given them a tag automatically, even if it's not advanced, and then given them an extra tag for each advancement counter. This would allow you to play it down unadvanced, and if they went to check your unadvanced remote, they could potentially get tagged. That would at least make it a credit tax. Also, if we're going to have this really weak advanceable trap, we should at least give it a trash cost. 0 trash cost makes this card very, very weak, and if we gave it like a 2 trash cost, at least it wouldn't die as often out of R&D. Next up we have the NBN Ice in the core set. The thing that all three of these have in common is this when encountered ability, and in general this is a really, really good idea that has been very much underutilized in the game. Even to this day, Ice are entirely too reliant on the subroutines, and this when encountered thing has proven to be extremely powerful because it's so hard to circumvent as the runner. I strongly resist the idea that this is an NBN specific ability. In general, I think that the when encountered stuff should be way more widespread, and we should have far more Ice that have abilities that aren't just subroutines. First up, we're going to talk about Data Raven. This is kind of a sleeper. It's started to see a lot more play today. I think as players realize that the when encountered ability is really strong and there's better and more prevalent tag punishment, especially with Traffic Accident, it's made it a lot easier for NBN to flatline the runner. And it's so hard to deal with Data Raven because you not only have the when encountered ability, but you also have a pretty relevant subroutine. This is sort of a reprint, but I would say this is the best improvement on an original design of any card in Netrunner. Not only does it have this awesome when encountered thing, but the way that the hosted counter works is way scarier on the new design. All around, this is a huge improvement over the original version. I love Data Raven. This is one of my favorite designs on a piece of Ice, period, and it's really impressive that they got it so right in the first release of the game. Next up we have Matrix Analyzer. This is easily one of the biggest failures when it comes to the add advancement token stuff that's kind of an NBN theme, and this card has really never made sense in an NBN deck because there's nothing to do with the counters. If this was intended to be used with large agendas, it should have been in a faction that actually plays and has them. It doesn't really make any sense to put this in a faction that has Astro Script and Breaking News, the easiest to score agendas in the game. There's a huge disparity in the power level of this advancement token oriented stuff in NBN. If it's being used to score an agenda or fast score an agenda, it's insanely powerful, and if it's being used for any other purpose, it's unplayably bad. Matrix Analyzer is definitely in the latter category, and this card would have just made a lot more sense as a Wayland card. Not only does Wayland have giant agendas like Government Takeover, but it also has agendas that get better if they have a bunch of advancement tokens on them, like Oaktown Renovation. Not to mention the giant variety of virtually unplayable advancement ice. Having some sort of ice with a when encountered ability would be really awesome for the advancement ice oriented stuff, and I think that deck has been the largest failure of the Wayland faction. We'll talk about that more in that video. Even if we ported this over to Wayland, I think it would still need to be better. I'm not sure why you have to pay 1 to place the advancement token. I think it could have just done it for free. And the trace probably should have been a little bit higher, just to make it a little more taxing for the runner. Next up is Toll Booth. To this day, this is one of the most powerful and most taxing high-end ice in the game, and this design is exactly what we're looking for in huge, really expensive ice. Again, the when encountered thing really shines with this. It makes it punish the runner if they face check it, and then it also has a solid end the run if they do happen to have the 3 credits and can get by. Toll Booth is another great design. This is an excellent high-end piece of ice, and I'd like to see more ice in this cost range being as good as Toll Booth. Next up is Red Herrings. This card is a direct reprint from the original game, and I think it's an okay design, but it needed to be better, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense in a faction that doesn't have agendas that you're trying to play into a remote, advance, and then score later. If this was intended to protect the central servers, it doesn't make a lot of sense that it had a 1 trash cost, since the runner's likely going to access it and trash it before you get it into play. This needed to be better, and my idea is to make it untrashable if the runner is tagged. This would incentivize one of the only areas of the design space that we can really expand the use of tags, which is tags that are given to the runner temporarily during a run. This is one of the few ways that we can have tags matter without it being this binary we kill them or don't sort of scenario, and I think the card Bandwidth is really onto something with its design, only it should have said when the run ends. If it was successful, remove the tag. Temporary tags make certain card effects a lot better, especially certain effects that only trigger when the runner is tagged. I'd like to see more of that on ice and just agendas and other card effects. I think that these temporary during a run tags should be way more widespread because they're one of the only ways to make tags a lot stronger and encourage the use of if the runner is tagged type effects without just having the tag effects devolve into scorching them. The last NBN card in the core set is the ever notorious San City Grid. This is basically a direct reprint. They just lowered the res and trash cost by 1. This is the way that fast advanced tools should work, and I think that this is definitely a good design. It's really expensive, it costs a lot of influence, and it requires some amount of setup to work. These are all hallmarks of good, fast, advanced design. If Astro Script wasn't so blatantly overpowered, I think this card would have a very good role in the game, and in general I think that this has always worked as intended, it's been played out of faction as intended, and this is just a great design. That's going to do it for the NBN portion of my core set retrospective. Most of the problems with core set NBN stem from one of 2 issues. First is that Astro Script has bad numeration and really just should have been replaced with something. It's forgivable that a card like this would have been in the original release of the game, since really the problem with it is just the numbers 3 and 2 printed on the card. What I find less forgivable is the fact that it hasn't been replaced and has instead been attempted to be addressed with printing of new cards like Clot. Like I mentioned, this has a lot of collateral damage and is just not good for the health and diversity of the game. The other main problem with NBN is the blending with Wayland effects, both the advancement counter-oriented stuff, but also the tag and flatline-oriented stuff. This has largely meant that Wayland is inferior at using the Scorched Earth-oriented stuff, And I think that most of these problems with NBN have actually had a bigger impact on that faction. The advancement token NBN cards are either really good or unplayably bad, and pretty much all of that stuff would make more sense in Wayland to make the advanceable ice-oriented cards a lot stronger. Clearly, Wayland was supposed to have a glacier strategy based on these advanceable ice, and unfortunately most of the cards from Order and Chaos have been unplayable because that strategy is just not very good. Now, I think some of that has to do with how terrible the ID associated with that stuff is, but also some of this crossover with NBN is at fault. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, please click subscribe and the button that looks like a thumbs up, and I'll see you again for the next part of this series.